The widow breastfed the abandoned Comanche baby through the brutal winter, her body miraculously producing milk where none should exist, until his father, the fierce warrior, arrived at her cabin door demanding his son back. The townspeople whisper she's cursed, a barren woman playing at motherhood with a savage's child. They expect her to surrender the infant and fade back into lonely obscurity. But the warrior sees something different, a fierce protector who transformed his dying son into a thriving child through impossible means. Neither knows their families are bound by a deadly secret that explains why she alone could save the baby. As federal marshals ride toward their frontier town to investigate the Indian problem, and the community demands the child's removal, one question remains. Will the truth about their connected past unite them, or will it destroy the fragile family they've built? The blizzard howled through Cedar Ridge as Sadie Mee Turlow pulled her shawl tighter against the bitter February wind. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the Kansas frontier town into a frozen wasteland. She hurried from the general store with her meager supplies, ignoring the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. The ghost widow, that's what they called her behind her back. 6 months since her husband died in that mysterious accident, and the townspeople expected her to simply disappear into her grief. She lived alone in the cabin 2 miles outside town, rarely speaking to anyone, buying only what she needed to survive another day. Hattie Sue Clemens stood on the store's porch, watching Sadie with cold eyes. The town's biggest gossip had made it her mission to remind everyone that something wasn't right about Jacob Turlow's death. Found face down in Miller Creek with no witnesses. No explanation. Just another mystery surrounding the strange woman who kept to herself. Sadie trudged through the knee-deep snow toward home, her boots crunching with each labored step. The wind cut through her thin coat like a blade. She should have stayed in town until the storm passed, but she couldn't bear another moment of their stares and whispered judgments. The crying reached her ears before she saw her cabin, high-pitched wails cutting through the wind. Sadie quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was coming from her front porch. A bundle of bloodied blankets lay against her door. The crying grew louder as she approached. Sadie dropped her supplies and knelt beside the bundle, pulling back the frozen cloth with trembling fingers. A baby, dark hair plastered to his tiny skull. Skin blue from cold. Comanche, by the look of the beadwork on his wrappings. Someone had left him here to die. Sadie scooped the infant against her chest and rushed inside. She built up the fire with desperate efficiency, her hands shaking as she stripped away the wet blankets. The baby's cries had weakened to pitiful whimpers. He was dying. She wrapped him in her warmest quilt and held him close to the flames. His breathing was shallow, labored. She had no idea how to care for a baby, had never been blessed with children of her own despite 5 years of marriage. But she knew enough to understand what he needed most. Milk. Sadie rummaged through her supplies, a small tin of condensed milk, sugar, clean water. She mixed them together and tried to feed the baby with a spoon, but he was too weak to swallow. Most of the mixture dribbled down his chin. The next morning brought no relief. The baby had barely survived the night, taking only tiny sips of the makeshift formula. Sadie bundled him up and made the treacherous journey to town through the fresh snow. Dr. Samuel Finch examined the infant with clinical detachment. He was a practical man who dealt in facts, not sentiment. "He needs a wet nurse," Dr. Finch said, handing the baby back to Sadie. "Real milk, not that sugar water you've been giving him. Without proper nursing, he'll be dead within days." Sadie's stomach dropped. Who in town might help? The doctor's expression said everything. Mrs. Henderson just finished weaning her youngest. Mrs. Campbell's still nursing, but... He trailed off, glancing at the baby's dark features. Sadie understood. No woman in Cedar Ridge would nurse a Comanche child. Sheriff Clyde Hartman arrived at the doctor's office as if summoned by her desperation. He was a large man with suspicious eyes and a badge that gave weight to his prejudices. "Heard you found yourself an Indian baby," he said, looking at the bundle in Sadie's arms like it might bite him. That's asking for trouble, Mrs. Turlow. Comanche don't abandon their young unless they're coming back for them. He was dying on my porch. Maybe that's for the best. Hartman's words hit like a slap. You keep that child, you're inviting war parties to our town. Federal marshals won't look kindly on harboring savages either. Sadie clutched the baby tighter. He's just a baby. He's a future warrior. Hartman tipped his hat. Think carefully about what you're doing, ma'am. Some things aren't worth the trouble they bring. That evening, alone in her cabin, Sadie watched the baby grow weaker. She'd tried everything. Cow's milk made him sick. Sugar water wasn't enough. He refused the bottle, turning his tiny head away from her clumsy attempts to feed him. In desperation, she unbuttoned her dress and held him to her chest. She had no milk to give, had never carried a child to term, but something deep inside her refused to let him die. The baby rooted against her skin with instinctive hunger. Sadie closed her eyes and willed her body to respond, to perform the miracle she'd heard about in whispered women's stories. Sometimes grief could make a woman's body do impossible things. Hours passed. The baby's breathing steadied against her chest, and then, like an answer to a prayer she'd been afraid to speak aloud, she felt the first warm drops. If you are enjoying this story of how one desperate act of compassion is about to change two different worlds forever, don't forget to comment where you are tuning in from to show how this story can connect us across any distances, backgrounds, and hearts, because what will happen in the next 15 minutes in this frontier town will completely change everything these two unlikely souls thought they knew about family, survival, and the power of love to bridge any divide. 3 weeks later, the baby had transformed completely. His cheeks were full and pink, his eyes bright and alert. Sadie had named him Thomas for the townspeople, but whispered Little Eagle when they were alone. The miracle of her body's response still amazed her every morning when he latched on to nurse. But miracles in Cedar Ridge drew the wrong kind of attention. Dr. Finch arrived unannounced on a gray March morning, his medical bag clutched tight in his weathered hands. He'd been losing sleep over the impossible situation at the Turlow cabin. "I need to examine you both," he said, stepping inside without invitation. His eyes moved between Sadie and the thriving infant in her arms. Sadie's chest tightened. She'd been dreading this moment. Dr. Finch conducted his examination with scientific precision. He checked the baby's weight, his reflexes, the clarity of his eyes. Then he turned to Sadie with a mixture of wonder and confusion. "How is this possible?" he asked. "You're producing milk like a woman who recently gave birth, but you've never been pregnant." Heat flooded Sadie's face. "I don't understand it myself. This is medically unprecedented." Dr. Finch packed his instruments with shaking hands. "The human body doesn't simply start lactating without pregnancy hormones." By afternoon, the entire town knew. Hattie Sue Clemens spread the news like wildfire, her voice carrying across every porch and parlor. The ghost widow had somehow managed to nurse a savage baby back to health through unnatural means. The whispers grew darker. Witchcraft, devil's work, unclean magic. Sadie felt their stares burning into her back every time she ventured to town for supplies. Mothers pulled their children closer when she passed. Men spat in the dirt and turned away. Sheriff Hartman appeared at her door 3 days after Dr. Finch's visit. His expression had hardened beyond mere suspicion into something approaching fear. "This has gone too far, Mrs. Turlow," he said, refusing to step inside. "People are scared. They're talking about bringing in a preacher to cleanse whatever evil you've brought to this town." "There's no evil here," Sadie said, bouncing Little Eagle against her shoulder. "Just a baby who needed help. A baby that's growing strong on milk that shouldn't exist." Hartman's hand rested on his gun belt. "I've sent word to the federal marshal's office. This situation needs official attention before it gets out of hand." That night, Sadie sat by her window watching the horizon. Little Eagle slept peacefully in her arms, his tiny fist curled against her chest. She'd saved his life, but at what cost? The town wanted them both gone. Federal marshals were coming. Soon she'd have to choose between her safety and the child who'd become her whole world. The warrior appeared at dawn. Sadie saw him first as a silhouette against the rising sun, sitting motionless on his painted horse at the edge of her property. He was massive, wrapped in buffalo hide and armed with weapons she couldn't name. Everything about him spoke of danger and death. Tall Wolf had been tracking his son for weeks, following cold trails and false leads across 3 territories. The baby's mother had died birthing him during a cavalry attack on their winter camp. In his grief and rage, Tall Wolf had left the infant with an elder woman and ridden off to seek vengeance. But vengeance had turned to ash in his mouth. He'd returned to find his son missing, taken by raiders who'd burned what remained of their camp. The trail had led him here, to this white woman's cabin where impossibly his child had not only survived but thrived. Sadie stepped onto her porch, little Eagle wrapped in her warmest blanket. The warrior's eyes found his son immediately. She saw recognition flash across his weathered features, followed by something that might have been relief. "You have my son," Tall Wolf said in heavily accented English. "I have a baby who was dying," Sadie replied. Her voice shook, but she stood her ground. Tall Wolf dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was even larger up close, scarred from countless battles, his presence filling the space between them like a storm front. "Give him to me." "No." The word surprised them both. Sadie clutched little Eagle tighter, her maternal instincts overriding every rational thought about survival. Tall Wolf studied her with new interest. He'd expected the white woman to surrender his son immediately, perhaps beg for mercy. He hadn't expected defiance. "He is my blood. He's been drinking mine for 3 weeks." Tall Wolf's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. His son was healthy, alert, obviously well fed and cared for. The woman showed no signs of fear despite facing a Comanche warrior alone. Most tellingly, the baby seemed content in her arms, making small cooing sounds instead of crying. "How did you feed him?" Sadie's cheeks burned red. "The way mothers feed their children. You have no children." "I do now." Something shifted in Tall Wolf's expression. He'd lost his wife, nearly lost his son, and spent weeks preparing to reclaim what remained of his family. But the woman before him had accomplished what he could not. She'd saved his child when he had abandoned him. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Sheriff Hartman rode up the hill with 6 armed men behind him, their faces grim with purpose. "Step away from the woman," Hartman called out, his gun already drawn. "We've got federal marshals coming to deal with this situation proper." Tall Wolf's hand moved to his tomahawk. Sadie found herself stepping closer to him instead of away, little Eagle safe between them. 3 weeks ago she'd been a forgotten widow. Now she stood between 2 armed forces, holding the child who'd given her purpose. The baby chose that moment to wake up hungry, his cries piercing the tense silence like a declaration of war. The federal marshals arrived 2 days later, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the muddy streets of Cedar Ridge. Marshal James Crawford was a career lawman who'd seen every kind of frontier trouble, but the situation at the Turlow cabin defied his experience. Tall Wolf had refused to leave. Instead of taking his son by force, he'd made camp near Sadie's property, creating an uneasy truce that had the entire town on edge. The warrior brought fresh game each morning and left it on her porch. Sadie cooked enough for 3 and set a plate outside for him. Neither spoke of the arrangement, but both understood its necessity. Sheriff Hartman briefed the marshals at his office while half the town gathered outside to listen. The story sounded impossible even to trained ears. A barren widow nursing an abandoned Comanche baby through supernatural means. A warrior father who wouldn't claim his healthy son. Federal intervention required before the situation exploded into violence. Dr. Finch provided medical testimony that raised more questions than answers. Sadie's lactation was medically unexplained but undeniably real. The baby showed perfect health and normal development. There were no signs of witchcraft or fraud, just an biological impossibility that somehow worked. Marshal Crawford visited the cabin that afternoon with official documents and a skeptical mind. He found Sadie feeding the baby while Tall Wolf sat nearby, carving a small wooden toy with methodical precision. The domestic scene looked almost normal until you considered its implications. "Mrs. Turlow, I need to understand your legal claim to this child," Crawford said, settling his bulk into Jacob's old chair. "He would have died without me." "That doesn't constitute legal adoption under territorial law." Tall Wolf looked up from his carving. "She saved my son when I could not." Crawford studied both adults carefully. "Mr. Wolf, you have the strongest legal claim here. Why haven't you taken the boy?" "A warrior does not steal from one who has given life." The marshal's frustration was evident. Legal precedent offered no guidance for a situation where biological father and surrogate mother both claimed parental rights based on honor rather than law. That evening, Sadie began preparing legal documents to formalize her claim. She needed proof of her ability to provide for Little Eagle, evidence of community support, and documentation of the baby's abandonment. The task seemed impossible until she decided to search through Jacob's belongings for anything that might help. Her husband had been a meticulous record keeper, storing papers in a wooden chest beneath their bed. Sadie had avoided opening it since his death, but desperation overcame grief. Inside, she found the usual documents: marriage certificate, land deed, receipts from various purchases. But at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items that made no sense. A Comanche medicine bag adorned with intricate beadwork, letters written in broken English describing meetings with the people, a leather journal filled with Jacob's careful handwriting about helping injured natives and learning their customs. Sadie's hands shook as she read entry after entry. Her husband had been secretly aiding Comanche families for years, providing medical supplies and safe passage through hostile territory. The final entries, written just before his death, described a desperate rescue mission during a cavalry raid. Tall Wolf found her sitting on the porch at midnight, clutching the medicine bag and crying. He recognized the beadwork immediately. "That belonged to Morning Star," he said quietly. "My wife." Jacob wrote about her. Sadie's voice was barely a whisper. "She was wounded in the attack on your camp. He tried to save her." Tall Wolf took the medicine bag with reverent hands. His wife had made it during her pregnancy, filling it with protective herbs for their unborn son. He'd thought it lost forever in the chaos of that terrible night. "Your husband died protecting my family," he said. "Morning Star used her last strength to pull him from the soldier's path. They died together, trying to save each other." The truth hit Sadie like a physical blow. Jacob hadn't died in an accident. He'd died a hero, sacrificing his life for people the rest of the world considered enemies. And Morning Star had died trying to save him. "The baby," Sadie whispered. "That's why I could feed him. Our families are connected by their sacrifice." Tall Wolf nodded slowly. "In my culture, such bonds create obligation across generations. You became mother to my son because his mother died saving your husband. The spirits arranged this." Dr. Finch arrived the next morning to find them poring over Jacob's journal together. The medical man listened to their story with growing amazement, his scientific mind struggling to process the implications. "Extreme emotional trauma can trigger lactation in rare cases," he admitted. "But this goes beyond medical explanation. The timing, the abandonment, your husband's connection to the child's mother. It's as if everything was orchestrated." Word of the revelation spread through town like wildfire. Hattie Sue Clemens, who'd witnessed strange activity the night of Jacob's death, finally came forward with her testimony. She'd seen him helping wounded natives escape through the darkness, never understanding what it meant. The federal marshals reconsidered their position. A white man dying to protect Comanche lives created legal complexities they weren't equipped to handle. The situation had moved beyond simple custody into questions of honor, sacrifice, and debts between peoples. Sheriff Hartman found himself in an impossible position. Half the town now viewed Jacob as a hero who died protecting the innocent. The other half still wanted the Indian problem removed permanently. A town meeting was called for the following evening. Everyone would have their say before the marshals made their final decision about Little Eagle's fate. Sadie and Tall Wolf spent that day preparing their case, knowing they had one chance to convince a divided community that love could transcend the boundaries of blood and culture. The town hall was packed beyond capacity on that warm April evening. Every seat was filled, with more people standing along the walls and crowding near the doorway. The smell of sweat and tension hung thick in the air as Marshal Crawford called the meeting to order. Sadie sat in the front row with Little Eagle sleeping peacefully in her arms. Tall Wolf stood beside her chair, his presence both protective and defiant. The baby had grown remarkably in the past month, his cheeks full and his eyes bright with intelligence. Sheriff Hartman presented the official case first. Federal law was clear about Indian custody issues. Biological fathers had primary rights unless proven unfit. The territorial government discouraged white families from adopting native children, fearing it would complicate future negotiations with the tribes. This situation sets a dangerous precedent, Hartman concluded. We can't have every abandoned Indian child becoming the responsibility of white settlers. Murmurs of agreement rippled through half the crowd. These were practical people who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. Sentiment couldn't override safety and legal precedent. Dr. Finch stood to address the medical aspects. His testimony about Sadie's miraculous lactation had been documented and verified. The baby's perfect health proved she was capable of providing proper care. From a purely medical standpoint, separating them now could be traumatic for both mother and child. I've practiced medicine for 20 years, Dr. Finch said. I've never seen a stronger bond between caregiver and infant. This goes beyond normal maternal attachment. Hattie Sue Clemens surprised everyone by rising to speak. The town gossip had spent weeks wrestling with her conscience about what she'd witnessed the night Jacob died. I saw him that night, she said, her voice shaking. Jacob Turlow helped those injured people escape through my back field. I was too scared to say anything before, but he died protecting innocent families from soldiers who'd lost control. The revelation shifted the mood in the room. Jacob had been well liked in the community. Learning he'd died heroically rather than accidentally changed how people viewed the entire situation. Marshal Crawford asked Sadie to present her case. She stood slowly, Little Eagle still cradled against her chest, and faced the crowd of neighbors who'd watched her transform from grieving widow to fierce mother. I didn't choose this, she began. But when I found a dying baby on my porch, I couldn't turn away. My husband died saving this child's mother. She died trying to save him. They created a bond between our families that transcends law or custom. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. I've nursed this baby with milk that shouldn't exist. I've loved him with a heart that was broken until he filled it. You can take him from me, but you can't undo what we've become to each other. Tall Wolf stepped forward when she finished. The crowd tensed as the imposing warrior addressed them directly. My wife died birthing this child, he said. I left him because my grief made me weak. This woman did what I could not. She chose love over fear, sacrifice over safety. In my culture, this makes her his mother in the truest sense. The warrior's unexpected eloquence surprised many who'd expected broken English and savage demands. I do not seek to take my son from one who saved his life. I seek to share in raising him with the honor both our cultures deserve. Marshal Crawford had never encountered a custody dispute quite like this one. Two parents from different worlds, united by tragedy and bound by honor, asking permission to raise a child together while maintaining their separate identities. The crowd began to murmur as the implications became clear. Tall Wolf wasn't demanding his son back. He was proposing a permanent arrangement that would keep both parents in the child's life. Dr. Finch stood again. I move that we allow this arrangement under my medical supervision. The child's welfare is paramount, and he's clearly thriving under Mrs. Turlow's care. Having his biological father involved ensures he'll learn his cultural heritage. The debate that followed was heated but civil. Some residents feared setting precedents that might encourage more mixed-race arrangements. Others saw an opportunity to prove that whites and natives could coexist peacefully. Sheriff Hartman found himself in the uncomfortable position of supporting the arrangement. The evidence of Jacob's heroism had changed his perspective on the entire situation. Perhaps some bridges were worth building. The vote was closer than anyone expected. 43 in favor of allowing the co-parenting arrangement. 37 opposed. Marshall Crawford made the decision official by declaring that federal oversight would continue for 6 months to ensure the child's welfare remained protected. 6 months later, the arrangement had exceeded everyone's expectations. Sadie had legally adopted Little Eagle, while Tall Wolf maintained his parental rights through tribal law. The child spent days with his adoptive mother learning settler customs and evenings with his father learning Comanche traditions. Sadie had become the town's unofficial midwife, her gift for nurturing extending to other mothers and babies in need. Her reputation for healing had spread to neighboring settlements, bringing visitors from across the territory. Tall Wolf had established a small trading post near town, serving as liaison between the Comanche bands and white settlers. His presence had actually reduced tensions, providing a voice for peaceful resolution of conflicts. Little Eagle thrived in his unique environment. At 15 months old, he spoke words in both English and Comanche. He moved easily between Sadie's cabin and Tall Wolf's lodge, equally comfortable in both worlds. The experiment in cross-cultural parenting had created something unprecedented on the frontier, a small pocket of peace where two peoples learned to see past their differences and focus on their shared humanity. On a warm October morning, Sadie watched Little Eagle take his first steps between his two parents, his chubby hands reaching for both of them with equal enthusiasm. The miracle that had begun with impossible milk had grown into something far greater. A family forged not by blood or law, but by the simple recognition that love knows no boundaries when it comes to protecting the innocent.